There's a commonly held belief amongst petrol heads that if you want a car with both space and pace, you get yourself one of these, an Audi RS6. But we're going to let you into a little secret. You see, the RS6 in all its iterations has never been that involving as a driver's car, and that's one of the reasons we fell in love with the BMW M3 Touring when we drove it for the first time late last year, because here was finally a comfortable cruiser with space for the whole family, and yet at the push of a button it transformed into a properly engaging and exciting machine. So why are we standing here in the middle of a car park with these two cars if we already know the outcome of this test? Well, the answer is we don't actually know the exact outcome of this particular test because this is no normal RS6. You see, as part of the RS6's midlife facelift, Audi has made a number of mechanical changes as well as adding the name Performance to its nomenclature. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, compared to the regular RS6, the Performance gets more power, a new active rear differential and four-wheel steering. And you also get the option of adding these lovely, lightweight, forged 22-inch wheels. Those are just the kind of changes we felt the RS6 needed to take on the M3 at its own game.
So stay with us to see if the RS6 Performance can fend off the BMW M3 Touring. And remember, to get a great deal on your next new car, visit whatcar.com.
But before we get started, let's address a question that I'm sure a number of you are asking. Why are we comparing the M3 Touring against the RS6 and not the RS4 Avant? Surely that would be the more natural pairing. Well, there's actually two reasons why we've chosen not to do that. And the first is that the RS4 Avant is getting a little long in the tooth. And even when it was launched, it was way behind the competition from a dynamic standpoint. And that was before the M3 Touring arrived and completely rewrote the rulebook. And secondly, the M3 Touring is really quite expensive. The RS4 starts at just over £70,000, whereas the M3 starts at over £86,000. And once you've added a couple of choice options, you're looking at a £100,000 estate car. And when you get to that kind of money, the jump up to the ultimate RS6 at £115,000 doesn't feel quite so severe. As you can see, there's actually plenty of room in the back of the M3 Touring. I'm 5'9" and I've got the driver's seat in my driving position. And I've got plenty of knee room and quite a bit of space under the seat to put my feet. I also reckon that these carbon back seats give you a little bit more room than the regular seats in a standard 3 Series Touring, just because they're so thin. But if you follow me over to the RS6, you can immediately see the benefit of this car's longer body. So although I have a similar amount of knee room, I can get my feet a lot further forward. And on top of that, these seat backs are reclined quite a bit further back than the M3's more upright seats, obviously because there's more boot space to play with. And because of that, you can recline and lounge out a little bit easier on a longer journey. The interior of the RS6 is also quite a bit wider than the M3 Touring, and that means you get a wider middle seat for a third rear seat passenger. The only problem is, if I climb into the middle, there's a massive transmission tunnel that robs you of footroom. Now, it's much the same in the M3 Touring, so that's worth keeping in mind if you want to do long distances 5 up. But if you want to take your kids to school or you're just traveling 5 up for a short journey, it shouldn't be too bad.
So it's clear that the RS6 is better in the back.
If you fold the rear seats down, the difference is even greater, with the RS6 offering up to 1,685 litres of space, which is nearly 200 litres more than you get in the BMW. Essentially, fold the rear seats down and this becomes a 600 brake horsepower van. When it comes to the interiors of these cars, both have their strengths and weaknesses. So starting in the RS6, you can see that Audi Sport has taken the already lovely looking interior of the standard A6 and ramped the sportiness up a few notches. So you get a sporty flat bottom steering wheel, Alcantara on a lot of your key touch points, and these heavily bolstered leather sports seats that have this really intricate matrix style pattern as inserts. To be honest, it all feels really well screwed together, that little bit better screwed together than the M3, and it looks very upmarket. I have to admit, the only car that gets close in this class for build quality is the much more expensive Porsche Panamera Sport Turismo. I should also mention that you get tons of kit as standard in the RS6, so you get a Bang & Olufsen sound system, a heads-up display, a 360-degree camera, loads of parking aids, and these seats are also heated and cooled. And if you go for the top-spec Vorsprung model, you also get a really trick-looking carbon fibre trim that has coloured strands running through it. It won't be to everybody's taste, but I quite like it. Considering that the M3 Touring's interior is based on the humble 3 Series, it is actually quite close to the RS6 when it comes to interior quality. And I also love the fact that you get a really wide selection of colours to choose from when it comes to picking your leather. This, strangely enough, is called Fiona Red, but I think it works really well with the silver matte paint outside. This also has a much better driving position than the RS6, which is pretty important in a performance car. Now, part of that is because this has heavily bolstered carbon back seats. These allow you to sit nice and low behind the steering wheel, and because they've got this aggressive bolstering, you feel locked in place when driving aggressively. You also have more space for your left foot in this car than the RS6. Now, that might seem a little bit odd, but the reason for that is in the RS6, the gearbox is so big, it actually encroaches a bit into where you would normally rest your left foot. That isn't a problem in this car. And again, it just stops you having aches and pains on longer journeys. The M3 also has the edge when it comes to infotainment. Now, we're not saying that we don't like the Audi setup. In fact, Audi's infotainment system is one of the best in the estate car class. However, because it has a lack of physical buttons, you often find yourself having to take your eyes from the road to find exactly what you want through the touchscreen. And that's not a problem in the M3 Touring, because yes, while you do have a touchscreen, which is really useful when you're parked, when you're on the move, you have BMW's famous iDrive system. So you have this rotary controller and physical buttons on the center console. And that means when you're driving along and you want to find something like, let's say, the telephone or your navigation, you don't actually have to look away. You can just feel it all by touch. And that's great, and it limits distraction when driving. So is there anything we don't like about the interior of the M3 Touring? Well, I think I might have found one thing. You see, I like these carbon back seats, but I'm the driver. I've had quite a few passengers complain about this little bit of carbon here. Now, it's designed to lock your legs into position when you're driving quickly, and that's great if you're on a track day or you're driving spiritedly on a country road. But if you're the passenger, it stops you from moving your legs about or crossing your legs on a long journey. So that is a little bit of an irritation, especially in what is supposed to be a long-legged GT car. On top of that, these beautiful red leather seats and this carbon fibre trim, all of it is optional. So if you want your M3 Touring to look exactly how you want it to look, just be aware that you're going to have to spend quite a lot of money. Right, that's enough of the practicalities out of the way. You want to know which one of this pair is the more exciting car to drive, and I thought I would start in the RS6 Performance because it's the relative unknown. As I mentioned earlier, it gets more power than the regular RS6 that it now replaces. Audi's done that by fitting a pair of larger turbochargers and upping the boost, and the result is 621 brake horsepower. That's 30 brake horsepower more than the car it replaces. That said, while 30 brake horsepower is a respectable gain, you've got to remember that this car weighs well over 2 tons. So I have to admit, from behind the wheel, it's hard to detect any increase in performance over the regular RS6. Like that car, it just feels ballistically quick. So we've established that this thing is properly quick, but more noticeable than any increase in performance is actually an increase in noise. Audi's ripped out a lot of the sound deadening from this car, allowing that V8 engine note to work its way into the interior. Compared to the rather flat-sounding six-cylinder in the M3 Touring, this V8 sounds far more aggressive and a lot more guttural. That said, even the regular RS6, although it was more muted than this, sounded better than the M3 Touring. Where the M3 really held an advantage over the RS6 was in the corners. It was just that much more nimble. So have the changes to this performance made it feel any sharper when you get to a bend? Well, as I mentioned earlier, as standard, this now gets rear wheel steering and an active rear differential. And I have to admit, in tight corners like this, when you're getting on the power on the exit, you can feel that rear differential working and sending power to the outside wheel to give you a little bit of rotation, helping you to get the car straightened up for the exit. So it's certainly more interactive to drive than the regular RS6, but you do find when you start to push really hard that the front end starts to push wide on exit. And if you do end up getting a bit of a slide, it feels quite heavy and will throw you back in the other direction if you're not careful. Ultimately, it just doesn't feel as light on its toes as the M3 Touring. And I think a big part of that problem is that as standard, this car comes on air suspension. And the upside of that is a really plush ride, which is great when you're doing long distances. But on a country road, it sometimes fails to keep full control of the body. You can get a lot of vertical movement, even in sport mode. Now, Audi does offer on the top spec Vorsprung model as standard something called dynamic ride control. And those are very clever, diagonally linked steel suspension. And while we haven't tried it on the RS6, we have tried it on the RS7, and it really does improve body control quite a lot. What dynamic ride control doesn't do, though, is transform this into a sharp, fun to throw around sports car. Ultimately, this is a heavy estate car and it likes to be driven in a clean and clinical manner. And to be fair, lots of people will love that about the RS6, a car that can get you from A to B incredibly quickly without taxing the driver too much. And I have to admit, at times I enjoy that, but when you're on a country road, I prefer a car that's more involving to drive and forces you to concentrate and really be part of that driving process. Speaking of which, I think now is a good time to head over and see how the M3 Touring is to drive. As soon as you jump behind the wheel of the M3, you realise it's not quite trying to strike the same balance between comfort and performance as the RS6. It's much more comfortable embracing its inner sports car. There's definitely more road noise in here, and the ride isn't quite as plush. But I have to admit, when you reach a country road, you simply don't care. There's just a lovely precision to everything the M3 Touring does. The steering is really nicely weighted and gives you lots of feedback about what's going on under those front tyres. And because you're bolted into this carbon back seat, you also feel everything that's going on underneath you. The M3 also feels a lot lighter than the RS6, and that's because it is. To create the performance, Audi stripped out a lot of sound deadening and also fitted lighter forged alloy wheels that are 5 kilograms lighter on each corner. But despite all of that, this still weighs over 200 kilograms less. And that means that it just feels a lot lighter on its feet, and you really feel that through quick changes of direction. The M3's four-wheel drive system also feels quite a bit more rear biased than the four-wheel drive system in the RS6. And while the RS6 does get that clever torque vectoring rear differential, BMW actually gives you the option of a rear-wheel drive mode in this. So at a push of a button, you can send 100% of the power, 100% of the time to the rear wheels. But I have to admit, the setup of the four-wheel drive system is so good in this, I never feel the need to use the rear-wheel drive setting. Speaking of settings, BMW gives you various options for engine responsiveness, the setup of the suspension, the steering weight, and even for your traction control and stability control. Now, my favorite configuration is to have my steering in sport. In comfort, I just find it too light. I have the suspension in sport because it improves the body control on bumpy country roads. And I like to have the stability control in MDM mode because it gives you a little bit of slip without you worrying about going backwards through a hedge. I also love that you can save those individual configurations to 2 buttons on the steering wheel, M1 and M2. So you can have the car set up for comfort on M1 and then have a really racy mode for M2, or whichever way you want it. And while you do have a similar setup in the RS6, you have to access your 2 drive modes, or 2 configurable settings, through just 1 button on the steering wheel, so it takes a little bit longer to scroll through to the mode that you want. Really, the only disappointing thing about the M3 Touring is that its 6-cylinder engine has a bit of a monotone and flat engine note. Now, it doesn't sound bad per se, it's just not as characterful as the V8 in that RS6. And that's a shame because as an engine, it's brilliant. Throttle response is really sharp, and considering that the 8-speed gearbox is a full automatic and not a dual clutch transmission, it's incredibly snappy. It's also pretty impressive that despite this engine being 100 brake horsepower down on the RS6, doesn't feel that much less powerful, and I reckon that's because the M3 Touring is just so much lighter. In fact, the claimed 0 to 60 times are really similar. BMW claims this will do 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds, and the Audi is 0.2 quicker at 3.4 seconds. But to be honest, from behind the wheel, you can't really detect that difference. Neither of these estates are what you would call cheap, but the M3 does undercut the RS6 by quite a bit. This car starts at just over £86,000, whereas the RS6 will cost you around £115,000. So that means, in effect, you could spec your M3 Touring up like our press car here, with satin paint, optional carbon ceramic brakes, and these beautiful carbon back seats, and you would still have plenty of change over what it would cost you to get in a base RS6 Performance. Notice we used the word base there, because if you want the all-singing, all-dancing Vorsprung model, which comes with goodies like those 22-inch forged wheels, a glass panoramic roof, a carbon fibre styling pack, and the dynamic ride control suspension, you're looking at closer to £130,000. So these are the facts. The RS6 Performance looks fantastic. It's monstrously quick in a straight line, and it makes long journeys disappear as if by magic. But it doesn't have the best driving position. Its pricing is, shall we say, a little bit punchy, and in base specification on standard air suspension, it's not the most rewarding car to drive on a demanding country road, which is a tough position to find itself in, because the M3 Touring is massively rewarding to drive. Before you even reach a country road, it's tugging on its collar like a little terrier, begging you to let it off the leash. Whereas with the RS6, you almost have to coax it to get up and go. And while the M3 Touring is expensive in relative terms, nothing else on sale blends practicality with dynamic brilliance quite so well. In short, if you have the money and the opportunity to buy one, you absolutely should. And then maybe lend me the keys once in a while.
For lots more information on both the Audi RS6 and BMW M3 Touring, make sure to head over to whatcar.com, where you'll find our detailed reviews. And before you go, make sure to subscribe to our channel to see lots more new car reviews like this, and tell us in the comments below what you think of the new RS6 Performance.